The morning was quiet in the way that only high country mornings could be, the kind of silence that suggested the world hadn't fully woken yet. Samuel Webb was 67 years old, and he'd learned to measure his days by small rituals. Coffee before dawn, checking the fence lines by mid-morning, sitting on the porch in the evening watching the light drain from the sky. He'd been alone for so long that solitude had stopped feeling like a choice and had become simply the default state of his existence. He came out to collect firewood just as the sun was breaking over the eastern ridge, and he almost missed it entirely. But something in the gate mechanism caught his attention. It wasn't locked properly, which was unusual. Samuel, who'd spent nearly 50 years on this ranch, didn't let anything slip past his notice. The dog was tied to the gate post. It was large, some kind of shepherd mix, Samuel thought, with a coat that suggested it had been cared for recently. Next to where it sat, on the weathered wooden gate post, was a note secured with a strip of leather. The dog looked up at Samuel with eyes that contained every kind of hope and heartbreak. Samuel approached slowly, assessing the animal for signs of distress or illness. The dog was breathing normally, appeared to be in good health, and seemed calmer than any abandoned animal should be. Samuel untied it gently, noticing the quality of the rope. Expensive, well-made, not something you'd use on a dog you didn't value. Then he opened the note. His hands began to shake before he'd finished reading 3 lines. The note was written in a careful, deliberate hand. Mr. Webb, my name is Michael. I'm writing from Denver, and I know this will come as a shock. I'm your grandson, the son your son Thomas had before he died 12 years ago. My mother has just passed away, and she spent her final days telling me about you. She told me that you and my father had a terrible argument when I was born, that you'd said things that couldn't be unsaid, that my father died believing you disowned him. She told me she kept the truth from you because she was angry, and by the time she wasn't angry anymore, so much time had passed that it seemed too late. She told me about this dog, about how you've always had German shepherds on your ranch, about how you raised them from puppies and trained them yourself. She told me you've never married, never had other children, and that you've spent your life alone. This dog's name is Samuel, after you. I trained him myself. He's smart, loyal, and he needs someone who understands how to care for him properly. But more than that, I'm hoping he might be a reason for you to understand that the past can be acknowledged without being forgotten. I'll be in Black Ridge in 2 weeks. If you want to meet me, I'll be staying at the Black Ridge Inn. If you don't, I'll understand. But please, take care of Samuel. He deserves better than to be a stranger's dog. Your grandson, Michael Webb. Samuel sat down on the ground, right there in the dust, and he began to weep. 12 years. 12 years since Thomas had died, and Samuel had believed his son had gone to his grave hating him. 12 years of carrying that weight, of understanding that his pride and his stubbornness had cost him everything. The dog, the one named after him, nuzzled against his shoulder as if understanding that the old man needed comfort. Samuel held onto the animal's neck and allowed himself to cry in a way he hadn't done since Thomas had walked out his life all those years ago. The story of the rift had begun simply enough, the way so many tragic stories do. Thomas had fallen in love with a woman named Elizabeth, a gentlewoman from a family that Samuel had considered unsuitable. When Thomas had announced they were going to marry, Samuel had forbidden it. He'd said things born from fear and pride, that Thomas was throwing away his future, that he was too young to make such a consequential decision, that marrying beneath him would ruin everything Samuel had built. Thomas had married her anyway. When Samuel learned that Elizabeth was pregnant shortly after the wedding, he'd been furious. He'd gone to Thomas's house with the intention of confronting him, of making him understand the consequences of his recklessness. But Thomas had been waiting for him, and he'd said something that Samuel had never forgotten. I love my wife. I love my child. And I'll be damned if I let you make me feel ashamed of that. Samuel had left. He'd told Thomas that if he chose Elizabeth and the baby over family loyalty, then he was no longer Samuel's son. It was a kind of ultimatum that a younger man gives, believing that the other person will always capitulate, that pride always wins in the end. He'd been wrong. Thomas had never come back, and Samuel had spent 12 years waiting for a son who was never going to arrive. living with the knowledge that somewhere in Denver, his grandson was growing up without knowing his grandfather existed. Samuel had built walls of routine and solitude to protect himself from that knowledge, had convinced himself that he was better off alone. The dog changed everything. Samuel brought him inside, gave him water, set up a space by the fire. He read the note again and again, each word landing like a blow and a blessing in equal measure. Michael was in Black Ridge. Michael wanted to meet him. Michael had sent a dog named Samuel as some kind of bridge between past and future. The dog was intelligent, clearly well-trained. Samuel worked with him through the day. Basic commands, walking patterns, the subtle language between man and animal. By evening, Samuel understood that Michael had taken considerable time training this animal, that the dog represented an investment of care and attention that suggested this grandson had thought very carefully about what his grandfather would value. That night, Samuel sat on the porch with the dog beside him, and he made a decision that terrified him. He would go to Black Ridge. He would meet Michael, and he would attempt to build something new from the ashes of what he destroyed with his own stubbornness. The town didn't know what to make of Samuel's transformation. He appeared at the general store the next morning with the dog, and within an hour, everyone in Black Ridge knew that Samuel Webb had received a visitor at his gate. Word traveled the way it always did in small towns, through gossip, through speculation, through the communal sense that something significant had happened. By the time Samuel walked into Black Ridge 3 days later, the entire town was watching. Michael was waiting in the lobby, a man in his early 30s with Samuel's eyes and Thomas's face. When he saw the old cowboy, he stood, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You brought him," Michael said, looking at the dog. "I couldn't leave him," Samuel said, not after understanding why he was sent. Michael extended his hand, and Samuel took it. The grip was firm, assured, the grip of a man who'd been raised with confidence and love. Samuel could feel in that handshake everything his son must have given to this grandson. Strength, assurance, the knowledge that he was wanted and valued. "I'm sorry," Samuel said, and the words felt inadequate for 12 years of absence. "I'm sorry for what I said to your father. I'm sorry that I wasn't there for you. I'm sorry that it took your mother's death for me to understand what I'd lost." Michael's eyes filled with tears. "My mother spent her final days telling me about you," he said. "She told me about the man you were before you let pride destroy your family. She told me that you were capable of love, that you trained those dogs with such care, because you understood loyalty. She told me she'd waited for you to come around, and when you didn't, she'd eventually married for practical reasons, but she'd never stopped believing that you could change if you understood the truth." "I was a fool," Samuel said. "You were human," Michael said. "You made a mistake, but you're making a different choice now. That's what matters." Samuel and Michael spent the next week getting to know each other. Michael told him about Thomas, about the father he'd never met but had heard about constantly, about the stories Elizabeth had told him, how Thomas had been a good man, how he'd loved fiercely, how he died believing his father had disowned him but clinging to the hope that someday, somehow, they might reconcile. Samuel told Michael about Thomas as a boy, about the bright, curious child who'd asked endless questions, who'd loved animals, who'd shown capacity for deep loyalty from an early age. He told Michael about the terrible argument, about the words he regretted, about the 12 years of living with the knowledge that he'd been wrong. By the end of the week, Michael had extended his stay. He wanted to see the ranch. He wanted to understand the land his father had grown up on. He wanted to build something with his grandfather rather than simply acknowledge the past. A month later, Michael had moved into the ranch permanently. He was a horse trainer by profession, the skill he'd inherited from generations of Webbs who understood animals in ways that transcended simple instruction. Together, Samuel and Michael began to rebuild a ranch, to expand the breeding operation, to create something that felt alive in a way it hadn't for 12 years. The town watched the transformation with a mixture of curiosity and satisfaction. The old cowboy who'd spent half his life in isolation had suddenly become a man with family, with purpose, with a future that extended beyond his own remaining years. The dog, Samuel, the younger, became the symbol of the reconciliation. He worked the property with both men, understood the emotional rhythm of the relationship that was being rebuilt, and seemed to take pleasure in the simple fact that his namesake was no longer alone. One evening, 6 months after Michael's arrival, Samuel and his grandson sat on the porch watching the sunset. "My mother told me something else," Michael said. Near the end, she said that holding on to anger was like holding on to a stone. The longer you held it, the heavier it became, until eventually it just crushed you. She said she'd held that stone for 12 years, and she wanted me to understand that life was too short for that kind of weight. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "Your mother was a wise woman." "She was," Michael agreed. "She didn't deserve to watch you suffer from a distance. But she was wise enough to know that eventually the truth would matter more than the pride." Samuel looked at his grandson, at this man who should have been a stranger, but who felt like redemption in human form. And he understood something fundamental, that the stone his mother had carried, and that he'd been carrying, had finally been set down, not forgotten, but acknowledged, honored, and released. The dog named Samuel had accomplished what no written apology could have. He brought a man and his grandson together. He'd been the bridge between past and future, the physical manifestation of a woman's deathbed wisdom, and a living embodiment of second chances. Samuel Webb, the old cowboy who'd spent half his life alone, discovered in his final years what his son had tried to teach him all those years ago, that love, genuine, fierce, uncompromising love, was worth any amount of pride, and that sometimes all it takes to rebuild what you've destroyed is a willingness to receive a gift you don't deserve and the courage to say yes to a future you believed was already behind you. The note that had left him weeping had become the beginning of the most important chapter of his life, and the dog, patient and loyal, had become the physical reminder that some bonds, family bonds, never truly disappear, no matter how much time, anger, or pride tries to sever them. They just wait, patiently, for the day when someone finally becomes brave enough to acknowledge what was always true, that love once given is never really lost.